Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to take a look at how to putt in Nintendo Switch Sports Golf. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for quite a while now. If you play NSS Golf, you'll realize how tricky it is to get your putts to sink in sometimes. There are many different scenarios you might find yourself in where you just don't know what to do. So in this video, we'll dive into some common misconceptions about putting and how to deal with certain slopes and how to read the terrain to better aim your shots more accurately. Of course, at the end of the day, it all comes down to practice and experience, and the best way to learn is to play. Something like local play is great for this since you can take your time and experiment with your shots. So with that out of the way, let's get to putting. I'm going to start off by showing you how I putt. This is probably the most important part of the video since having a consistent putting method lets you putt reliably. And essentially, I only use my left hand to putt. I don't need my right hand at all. The way I putt relies on me flicking my wrist slightly, and how hard I flick my wrist corresponds to how strong the shot is. I'm going to show it to you in slow motion. Basically, I just move my whole arm in the direction of the swing and then flick my wrist at the end. Do it all in one motion, and this is what you get. I find this method of putting to be the most consistent for me. Personally, I don't like how putting works in this game. It feels unintuitive and lacks consistency. But I'm curious to see if this method works for you guys, so be sure to let me know in the comments. Now let's talk about the basics. When you're on the green, you have the ability to change your camera's perspective by clicking your left joystick. This changes your view to a lower angle, which helps you see the terrain better, and this is especially useful when there is a subtle slope that is hard to see from the normal camera view. There's also the terrain button, which you can use by clicking the down button on the D-pad. And this lets you see a height map of the terrain, meaning you can see the high and low points of the putting area. And this is an insanely useful tool for seeing the steepness of slopes. Let's take a look at this for a second. Notice the indication on the minimap showing what the colors of the height map mean. The more yellow a section of terrain is, the higher up it is, while bluer sections of terrain indicate lower sections. In this case, you can see that there are 3 sections of terrain between me and the flag. The color is yellow where I'm standing and getting bluer in color towards the flag, and this tells me that the terrain is going downhill. Another thing to pay attention to is to see which way the slopes are angled. In other words, which way will the ball roll if we put our ball straight at the flag. In this case, we see that the slope we're standing on radiates mainly to the right in the north direction, and that the size of each height indicator is very wide, and this tells us that the slopes are relatively flat. Since the slopes are not that steep, we don't have to adjust too much to the left. Another thing to keep in mind is that the first height section covers a much wider area than the following 2, and you can see that it covers about half the distance between me and the flag. And this tells me that the ball will move straight for the first half of its path and then slightly curve to the right in the second half. And finally, let's take a look at how much power I'll need. We can see on the minimap that we're going to need just a little under full power to reach the flag, but remember to always keep in mind what the terrain is like. In this case, we are moving slightly downhill, which means we can use anywhere between 3 and 4 dots of power for a smooth roll-in. Anything more than full power might result in you lipping out, and anything below 3 dots will make you stop early. Now that we know all this, let's take the shot. Aiming slightly to the left and with around 3.5 dots of power, we can see that it rolls right in. Remember to always use the angle change and the terrain height map tools every single time you putt. They help you so much in figuring out the optimal shot and will help you get the feel for most maps the more you play. Alright, before we get into any intermediate putting, let's clear up some misconceptions. Firstly, let's understand that the minimap is a liar. While it gives you a lot of information about winds, terrain, and power, it tells it to you with the assumption that you're taking the perfect shot. In this case of putting, it assumes we're hitting the ball on a completely flat green area. It works like that for regular shots too, not just putting, so keep that in mind when using wedges and such. The minimap is a tool, not a cheat code. Let's see what happens when we're on the fairway instead of the green. You can see that it tells us if we use full power, we'll end up right at the hole. So let's try that and see what happens. Now I actually used a little more than full power and we still didn't reach the flag. We still have a quarter of the distance to go. And this happens because the fairway has a much higher friction than the green does. It slows the ball down a lot more, so by the time the ball gets on the green, it doesn't have enough speed to go where you want it to. And let's take a look at another example here. We're aiming at the rough, and according to the minimap, the ball should land right on the edge of the rough with full power. And even though we didn't do full power, we almost did it, but you can see we didn't even make it halfway to the rough. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go for putts from the fairway. Even a shot like this is still possible, it just takes a bit of getting used to. But you might be asking yourself, why would you want to putt from the fairway when you can just use the wedge? When you're playing on a map with any kind of wind, hitting the ball in the air will make the wind push the ball in the direction it's going. If the wind is high, it'll push the ball a lot more, and this brings me to the next misconception. Your ball doesn't get affected by the wind when you putt. Let's take a look at this example where we have 31 mph winds. If we hit the ball with a power of 2 dots, it should end up somewhere here. If the wind has any effect on the ball while putting, it'll end up somewhere to the left of that. And there you have it. The ball went in a straight line. Let's go back to where we were. And because of the slope, hitting with a power of 2 dots should make our ball end up somewhere around here. And as you can see, the ball didn't move to the right at all. It did move to the left because that's the way the slope was facing. The wind also has no influence on the speed of the ball, meaning if you putt the ball in the direction the wind is already blowing, the wind will not increase the ball speed like it normally would with the rest of the clubs. And the same goes for when putting against the wind. Your ball will not slow down. And as you can see, it again went in a straight line, and any extra distance was due to the downward slope of the hill. When putting from the fringe or fairway, you'll notice that you no longer have the ability to change camera angles even when equipping the putter. Instead, that button is used for zooming into the mini-map, and you're only left with the terrain button. Here we can see that the terrain of the green has a downward slope going left, with the lowest point being the dark blue circle to the left of the flag over here. The ball will move towards the deepest point of the green, meaning in our case it will move left. And we can see that the slope is semi-steep. We know this because the height changes are not too wide or too narrow, which means our ball will have a noticeable curve, but not by much. Something to keep in mind is that when you are putting against the side of the slope like we are here, the more power you use, the less the slope will affect your ball. However, this also means that your ball will be traveling fast and will have a higher chance of lipping out of the hole, and finding the right amount of power will take some time to getting used to, but can be approximated with the minimap. Here you can see it tells us that we need 1.5 dots of power to reach the flag, but we need to account for the fact that we're on the fairway, so I'll add about half a dot's worth of power to my shot. I'm aiming slightly to the right here to adjust for the slope, and if we do this, it should only slightly curve to the left and go into the hole. Here's a pro tip and something to keep in mind. When putting from outside the green, the flag will not be removed, and you can use this to your advantage by trying to aim your shot so that the ball hits the flagpole. If you do that, even if you do a little too much power, the flagpole will stop the ball in its tracks, causing it to sink in. Okay, let's take a look at this example. Here we have a downhill slope that's right in front of us, not too far away. And notice how we're standing on a hill that's also going to the right, and it's kind of on the steep side. The first thing I would do is of course aim slightly to the left to account for that, and even though we're on a steepish slope, since the hole is right in front of me, there's no need to adjust too much. Secondly, since I know I'm going downhill, I know that I'll have to use less power than whatever power the game tells me to use. In this case, it says to do just under the first dot of power, so instead I'll use about half a dot's worth of power, and let the terrain do the rest of the work for me. First things first, I'll check the camera angle and the terrain to make sure I have the right idea about the situation. Remember to take your time when putting, you don't want to rush things and mess up. The game is very lenient with the time that it gives you, so make sure you have the right angle before shooting. And finally, I try to line up the power correctly, and then I take my shot. Now let's do the same thing from the other side. In this example, we want to do the opposite of what we did in the last shot. I see that we're going uphill and that the hill is angled slightly left, so I'm going to counter that by aiming slightly right and adding about half a dot's worth of power to my shot. And you can see it goes right in. Okay, let's take a look at some long putts. Long putts are hard because you need to account for various terrain changes throughout the green. Notice how there are three main terrain changes for this shot: the hill that I'm standing on, the downward slope after it, and the upward slope of the hill that the flag is on. First, let's look at the hill that I'm on. I'm not exactly on top of the hill, I'm a little behind it, and I'm also standing on the right side of the hill, meaning I'm going slightly against it. If I shoot straight at the flag, the ball will curve to the right, since that's where the slope is heading. And if I adjust for this by aiming to the left, the next thing we need to keep in mind is that the ball will move downhill, meaning the ball will speed up. However, it will then approach an upwards hill where the flag is and slow back down. You can see that the hill that the flag is on is declining to the right, and you might think this means that we need to again adjust our shot and aim more to the left over here, but this is not always true. Let's take a look at what happens when we aim to the left. We see that when we aim to the left, we are now going against the hill that we're on, rather than going against the side of the hill. The more towards the center of the hill we aim, the less the ball will move in the direction of its slope. So now the only hill that we need to adjust for is the one the flag is on. It's a little steep, but since the flag is not too far up the slope, the second hill will not have such a strong effect on our ball. And trying to visualize this in my head, I see that the ball will move forward downhill and then slightly curve to the right. And finally, looking at the minimap, I see that we'll need about full power to reach the flag. Since the ball will be rolling downhill and then uphill, the speed of the ball will more or less even out as if we're on a flat surface, so using full power seems about right. So now I'm going to try get a feel for hitting a full power shot. And I did a little too much power, but it still rolls in. If I did any more power there, probably would have lipped out or maybe just missed the hole entirely. But the main takeaway for this example is that you should always think about what happens when you adjust your shot. In this case, aiming to the left meant that I no longer had to adjust my shot for the hill that I was on. And if I had done that, I would have aimed too much to the left and would have just missed. Okay, let's talk about slopes now. You can see the minimap tells me to use a bit under 2 dots of power to get the ball in the hole. There's no noticeable angle that the slope is taking, so we can aim straight at it. But of course we are going uphill, and notice how thin the height change indicators are. And this of course means that we're going up a steep hill. This means that we need to aim much more than what the minimap tells us, because now the ball will be fighting gravity on top of friction. And for this example, aiming anywhere between 2.5 to 3 dots of power should make the ball roll in smoothly. Now, I end up doing a little more than 3 dots of power, and you can see just how fast the ball was moving. If I had done 3.5 dots of power or more, I probably would have lipped out, and anything under 2.5 dots of power would have caused the ball to stop short. And these next 2 clips are for demonstration purposes, just to show how much difference power makes when going up a steep hill. You can see that I'm on the fringe here and use about 3 1/3 dots of power, and it rolled in pretty nicely. And here, I'm on the fringe again, just a little further away this time, and I use about 3 dots worth of power, and the ball stopped short. And this is because of the fact that we're going uphill, so even slight differences make a big impact on where the ball will end up. When going up a steep hill, the ball will slow down faster, so it's better to overestimate than to underestimate the power of your shot. Now let's talk about a steep downhill slope. When it comes to going downhill on a steep angle like this, you want gravity to do most of the work for you, because now you have to think about it in the opposite way of when you have to go uphill. Instead of the ball fighting gravity, it is now being pushed down by it. So on top of the power you put into your shot, gravity will also be pushing the ball down the hill, which will add more speed to the ball. In this example, what I need to make sure I get right is the angle. Since I'm not going to put much power into my shot, it means that I need to angle it more to the right. Remember that the faster your ball moves, the less it will curve, and the opposite is also true. the slower your ball moves, the more it will follow the curve of the hill. So now looking at the mini-map, it tells me that I need about 1 dot's worth of power to get to the hole. But since I'm going downhill at a steep angle, I only need about 1/4 or at most 1/2 dot's worth of power. Here's another example where I'm just a bit further away from the hole. The same rules still apply. I don't want to use more than 1/2 dot's worth of power because the slope gets steeper and steeper, meaning the ball will speed up until it reaches the bottom. Using anything above 1 dot will cause me to lip out because the ball will be moving too fast to be able to sink in properly. Sometimes you might find yourself really close to the hole while also going up or downhill. In this case of me going downhill, using anything above 1/4 dot's worth of power might make me lip out. So what I want to do is aim as far to the left as I can, because the more I aim at an angle, the less it will be impacted by the downward slope. Okay, the last thing I want to take a look at is going up and over a hill. So far we've looked at going uphill and downhill, but this is both at the same time. And in this case, it's pretty steep both ways too. These might look challenging at first, but let's break it up into smaller problems. Let's understand that we're going up a steep hill first. We can see that the minimap tells us to use about 1.5 dots of power to get to the top of the slope, but of course we'll need more, somewhere around 2 dots of power, to make sure the ball has enough speed to go over the hill and then roll down. We know that the ball will eventually roll down, so we don't want the ball to have too much speed when starting to go downhill. Otherwise, it will lip out when it reaches the hole, since there's too much speed to allow it to smoothly sink in. And finally, you might have not noticed this, but there's a hill moving to the right over here, which impacts our uphill slope very slightly. You can see it better from this angle. If we aim a little to the left, we'll see that our ball will curve slightly to the right by the time it reaches the top of the hill. The same will also happen on the other side of the hill, but since this isn't such a sharp angle, we don't have to adjust too much. I'm going to use 2.5 dots worth of power for the shot, because 2 dots will get me to the top of the hill, and the extra half dot will make sure that the ball has enough speed to roll down the hill all the way. So this concludes my tutorial on how to putt like a pro. I really hope you guys found this video helpful. It took me a lot of time to record and edit, and I tried to explain everything as best as I could. Of course, you can always rewatch sections that weren't so clear, and any extra questions you have, feel free to ask me in the comments. I'll answer everything as best as I can. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.